Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship and watched the alien vessels come closer through the big screen, their shiny hulls looking like scattered jewels against the dark space, and he felt that familiar cold feeling in his stomach. That always came when another new species showed up at Earth's doorstep with smiles and promises. The Zilani ships moved in perfect formation, each one the size of a city block and gleaming with technology that made human vessels look like toys. But Jake had seen this dance before, and he knew how it usually ended. Lieutenant Amy Carter turned from her station with excitement in her voice as she reported that the aliens were asking permission to dock at Luna Station, the big space station that orbited Earth's moon and served as humanity's main diplomatic center, and Jake could see in her young face the same hope that had gotten so many humans killed over the past 50 years. The Zilani had been broadcasting their message across all human space for 3 days now, speaking of peace and trade and sharing knowledge, and their ambassador looked almost human except for the silver skin and those two perfect features that seemed designed to make people trust him. Commander Pete Rodriguez caught Jake's eye from across the bridge, and the look they shared said everything without words because both men had been there when the vegan ambassadors had spoken the same sweet words right before their battle fleets showed up, and they had been there when the Rigel Compact had turned out to be nothing more than a way to map human defenses before the attack came. Pete nodded toward the communications station, and Jake knew his first officer was thinking the same thing he was thinking, that this felt too familiar and too dangerous to be real. Dar Lisa Hayes looked up from her science station with a frown and asked why beings with such advanced technology would need to trick humans when they could just take whatever they wanted by force. And Jake almost smiled at the question because it was exactly the right question and exactly the wrong time to be asking it. The young scientist had joined the crew only 6 months ago, and she still believed that the universe was a place where logic and reason mattered more than hunger and greed. But Jake had learned the hard way that the most dangerous predators were the ones who pretended to be friends. Jake told Amy to send a response welcoming the Zilani, but reminding them that all diplomatic ships had to follow security rules, and he could see the alien's ambassador smile on the main screen as if he had expected nothing less, which made Jake's skin crawl because it meant these beings had studied human responses and knew exactly what to expect. The captain then ordered Amy to open a secure channel to Earth Command using the highest level of encryption they had. Because some conversations needed to happen away from alien ears, Admiral Patricia Wong's tired face appeared on the private screen a few minutes later, her gray hair pulled back tight and her eyes showing the weight of too many years dealing with species that wanted to destroy humanity. And she looked at Jake with the expression of someone who had been expecting this call. Jake asked for permission to start Protocol Skeptic, which was the fancy name for what humans did best, being suspicious and careful and checking everything twice before believing anything, and the Admiral nodded like she had been waiting for exactly those words. The Admiral told Jake that the whole thing reminded her of the Proxima Gambit, which had been another case of aliens showing up with gifts and promises right before they tried to steal 3 human colonies, and she gave Jake permission to do whatever he needed to do to protect his people. Jake thanked her and cut the connection, then turned to address his senior officers with the kind of serious voice that meant everyone needed to pay attention right now. Jake called for a meeting in 30 minutes and told everyone they were going to do what humans had learned to do over 50 years of being hunted, which was to be paranoid and suspicious and investigate everything before making any deals. Because the species that survived in this galaxy were the ones that never trusted anyone completely. Dr. Hayes started to say something about giving the aliens a fair chance, but Pete held up a hand and reminded her that fairness was a luxury that dead species could not afford. The Zilani ships waited in space like patient spiders, their hulls reflecting the light from Earth's sun and their communication arrays probably recording every human transmission they could detect, while Jake and his crew prepared to play the same deadly game that had been going on since humans first left their home planet. Jake looked at the alien vessels one more time and wondered if these particular predators knew that their prey had been learning and adapting for decades. or if they thought humans were still the same naive species that had almost been wiped. Out during first contact with the hegemony, Amy reported that the Zilani were asking about cultural exchange programs and requesting detailed information about human art and music and literature, which sounded innocent enough, except that Jake knew from experience that conquering species always wanted to understand their victim's psychology before moving to the next phase. The captain ordered his crew to prepare false information packages that would give the aliens what they expected to see while hiding what humans really were. Because in a galaxy full of monsters, sometimes the best defense was to look like prey. Until it was time to show your teeth, the game was beginning again, and this time humanity was ready to play. 3 days had passed since the Zilani arrived at Luna Station, and Lieutenant Commander Ryan Blake had barely slept as he worked through mountains of intercepted data that painted a picture no one wanted to see, but everyone needed to understand. Blake had been a Special Forces soldier before becoming an intelligence officer, and his years of hunting human enemies had taught him to recognize the signs when someone was hunting him, which was exactly what the aliens were doing, despite their pretty words about peace and friendship. Blake knocked on Captain Morrison's door and entered the ready room with a portable display unit in his hands and the kind of expression that meant bad news was coming, while Jake looked up from his morning reports and prepared himself for whatever his intelligence officer had discovered. The younger man activated his display and showed communication patterns that looked innocent to most people but told a very different story to anyone who knew how to read them. Because the Zilani were sending encrypted messages back to their hidden fleet every 6 hours like clockwork, Ryan explained that while they could not break the alien encryption, they could analyze when the messages were sent and how long they lasted and what kind of data was being transmitted, and the patterns matched intelligence gathering operations from 17 different species that had tried to conquer human worlds over the past 50 years. Jake leaned forward in his chair and asked what exactly the aliens were looking for, and Ryan pulled up another screen that showed the Zilani had been systematically probing human defensive networks, resource databases, and political structures. Dr. Hayes had been invited to the meeting because her cultural exchanges with the aliens gave her access to information that pure intelligence work could not provide, and she listened to Ryan's report with growing concern before arguing that any responsible government would want to understand a potential trading partner. Blake nodded politely and then showed her the trajectory analysis that had taken his team 2 days to complete. Because tracking the path of alien ships through space was like following footprints through a forest, and these particular footprints led to some very dark places. The analysis showed that the Zilani had not come directly from their home territory as they claimed, but had instead made stops at 4 different star systems that used to belong to something called the hegemony before. Those worlds went silent and empty. Jake felt his blood turn cold because every human officer knew about the hegemony worlds, which had been thriving colonies with millions of people until they accepted generous trade agreements with friendly aliens, and now those worlds were nothing but empty cities and silent communication arrays. Blake continued his report by explaining that the energy signatures from the Zilani ships matched residual traces found at the dead worlds, which meant these particular aliens had been there recently and probably knew exactly what had happened to the missing populations. Dr. Hayes asked how they could be certain the Zilani were involved in whatever happened to those people, and Chief Engineer Danny Collins spoke up from his position near the door with technical data that made everyone's worst fears seem real. Danny had been analyzing the technology the aliens were offering to share with humanity, comparing it to the power readings his sensors were getting from their ships, and the results showed that the Zilani were holding back their best equipment while offering humans outdated technology that was at least 3 generations behind what they actually used. Jake stood up and walked to the viewport where he could see the alien ships hanging in space like beautiful predators waiting for the right moment to strike. And he realized that everything about this situation felt like a trap. The captain asked Blake to recommend their next move, and the intelligence officer suggested implementing the Taurus Protocol, which was a fancy way of saying they should feed false information to the aliens while gathering more evidence of their real intentions. Dr. Hayes looked uncomfortable with the idea of lying to beings who might genuinely want peace, but Pete Rodriguez reminded her that the last species to fool them with peaceful intentions had killed 2 million humans before the deception was exposed. Jake turned back to face his officers and told Dr. Hayes that she could continue her cultural exchanges with the aliens, but she needed to understand that everything she shared might be used against humanity later, because in 50 years of contact with alien species, only one had turned out to be genuinely peaceful. The doctor asked what made humans so suspicious compared to other species, and Jake explained that most civilizations never survived their first encounter with predatory aliens, which meant only the paranoid species lived long enough to become experienced. Blake added that the Zilani were following a standard playbook that humanity had seen many times before, starting with peaceful contact and cultural exchange, followed by intelligence gathering and fleet positioning, and ending with demands for surrender backed by overwhelming force. The pattern was so common that human military academies taught courses on recognizing and countering it, because knowing what was coming next gave defenders a crucial advantage in preparing their response. Jake activated the ship's communication system and ordered all senior staff to implement Condition Yellow protocols, which meant increased security measures and enhanced surveillance of their alien guests, while he made plans to contact other human colonies and warn them about what was probably coming. The captain also sent a coded message to Admiral Wong requesting permission to begin Phase 2 of their defensive preparations, because if the Zilani were following the standard conquest playbook, humanity needed to start following their own survival playbook. Dr. Hayes asked one final question about whether they might be making a terrible mistake by assuming the worst about the aliens, and Jake looked at her with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many friends die because they trusted the wrong people. He told her that in a galaxy where 13 out of 14 first contact situations had turned out to be attacks in disguise, assuming the worst was not paranoia but wisdom, and the species that survived were the ones that prepared for war while hoping for peace. Commander Sandra Kelly crawled through the narrow maintenance shaft beneath Luna Station's diplomatic quarters, her security equipment weighing down her belt as she installed the last of the surveillance devices that would give humanity eyes and ears in places the aliens thought were private. Sandra had been head of station security for 8 years, and she had learned that the best way to catch someone lying was to watch what they did when they thought no one was looking, which was exactly what she planned to do with their Zilani guests. Sergeant Mike Torres whispered through her earpiece that the alien ambassador was moving towards Section C with 2 guards, and Sandra adjusted her position to get a better view through her micro camera while trying not to make any noise. That might give away her hiding place. The Zilani moved through the corridors like they owned the place, their silver skin gleaming under the station lights and their 2 perfect faces showing no emotion, but Sandra had been watching them for days and she could see the way they checked corners and measured distances like soldiers preparing for battle. In the station's command center, Captain Morrison stood next to Admiral Wong and watched the security feeds that showed their alien visitors exploring areas they had no reason to visit, while the Admiral's presence reminded everyone just how seriously Earth Command was taking this situation. Sandra's voice came through the communication system to report that the Zilani delegation had tried to access secured areas 7 times in 3 days, and each time they claimed it was an accident or a misunderstanding, which was exactly the kind of excuse that guilty people always used. Admiral Wong asked about the aliens' requests for information about human industry, and Jake told her that the Zilani seemed particularly interested in manufacturing capabilities and resource extraction operations, which was the same kind of intelligence that conquering species always wanted before they decided whether a target was worth attacking. Dr. Hayes approached them with a troubled expression and reported that her cultural exchanges with the aliens seemed genuine, and their interest in human art and music appeared to be real, but the Admiral reminded her that the best predators were the ones who could convince their prey to trust them. Sandra's voice crackled through the communication system again to report that the ambassador had just accessed a restricted terminal in Section D and was downloading information about defensive grid configurations, which was exactly the kind of activity that turned suspicion into certainty. Jake's expression hardened as he realized that the aliens had finally made a mistake that could not be explained away as cultural misunderstanding, and he asked Admiral Wong for permission to implement Phase 2 of the Taurus Protocol, which would show the aliens what humanity wanted them to see instead of what was really there. Chief Warrant Officer Carl Spencer had spent the past week in the depths of Luna Station preparing fake data packets that would convince the Zilani that human defenses were both weaker and stronger than they actually were, because the best way to fool an enemy was to give them information that was wrong in multiple directions. Spencer had been a cyber warfare specialist before joining the diplomatic corps, and he understood that in the modern age, information was often more valuable than weapons, which meant controlling information was the key to controlling outcomes. Spencer reported that he was uploading false defensive specifications that would make the aliens believe human shields were 30% weaker than their actual strength, while also making them think that humanity possessed weapon systems that did not actually exist. The beauty of human deception was that it relied on the enemy's own assumptions and expectations, because most alien species had never encountered a civilization that used misdirection and psychological warfare as primary defensive strategies. Lieutenant Blake's intelligence team had made another breakthrough in their analysis of alien communications, and he reported that the Zilani fleet was moving into positions that looked like preparation for a blockade, which was the classic formation used by conquering species right before they demanded surrender. Dr. Hayes shook her head in dismay and asked if the aliens were really going to attack after all their peaceful overtures, and Commander Rodriguez reminded her that this was exactly what had happened to the colonies at Vega Prime 3 years earlier. Jake activated the general quarters alarm and announced that all civilian personnel should report to designated safe areas, while his crew prepared for the possibility that their diplomatic mission was about to become a shooting war. Admiral Wong placed her hand on Jake's shoulder and told him it was time to remind the aliens why humanity had survived every first contact scenario that had been thrown at them, because humans had learned to turn their apparent weaknesses into hidden strengths. The captain ordered his communications officer to signal the hidden human fleet and activate Operation Revelation, which would show the Zilani that humanity was much better prepared than they appeared to be while across human space. Warships began emerging from asteroid fields and moon bases where they had been waiting for exactly this moment. The aliens were about to discover that humans had been reading their playbook for decades and had written detailed responses to every chapter. Dr. Hayes watched the tactical displays with growing amazement as ship after ship appeared on the sensors, and she realized that humanity had been planning for this possibility since the moment the aliens arrived, because the species that survived in a hostile galaxy were the ones that hoped for the best while preparing for the worst. Sandra Kelly's voice came through the communication system to report that all Zilani personnel were now in custody, and they had found military-grade scanning equipment hidden in diplomatic pouches, along with evidence of attempted sabotage in the engineering sections. The Zilani ambassador's calm facade finally cracked when he realized that his people had been caught, and his request for immediate communication carried the desperation of someone whose careful plans had just fallen apart. Jake smiled grimly as he prepared to show the aliens that humanity had learned to turn every peaceful overture into a potential trap, because in a galaxy full of predators, the species that survived were the ones that became better predators than their enemies. Admiral Wong reminded Jake that this was humanity's chance to send a message to every other species in the galaxy, a message that said humans were no longer naive prey waiting to be harvested, but experienced survivors who had learned to recognize danger and respond with overwhelming force when necessary, and the time had come to make that message very clear indeed. The first sign that the Zilani plan had gone terribly wrong came when their supposedly secret fleet positions were broadcast on open communication channels for every ship in the system to see, and Captain Jake Morrison felt a grim satisfaction as he watched the alien formation break apart in confusion like a flock of birds scattered by sudden thunder. The aliens had spent weeks carefully positioning their ships for what they thought would be a surprise attack, but humanity had been tracking every movement and preparing countermoves that would turn the hunters into the hunted. Lieutenant Amy Carter reported that the Zilani ambassador was requesting immediate communication with obvious desperation in his voice, and Jake told her to put the alien through because he wanted to see how their visitor would try to explain away the evidence that had been piling up for days. The ambassador appeared on the main screen with his previously calm expression now showing cracks of stress and fear, and he started talking about misunderstandings and routine defensive measures like someone trying to talk his way out of a crime scene. Jake interrupted the alien's excuses and told him that humanity had been monitoring Zilani communications for the past week, and they knew about the visits to the dead hegemony worlds, the intelligence gathering operations, and the attack fleet positioning that was supposed to remain secret. The ambassador's composure cracked a little more as he realized that his people's careful deception had been exposed, and he tried to claim that any problems could be resolved through proper diplomatic channels like he still thought humans were. Naive enough to believe his lies, Admiral Wong stepped into view of the communication screen and told the ambassador that humanity had been dealing with species like his for over 50 years, and they all followed the same predictable pattern of approaching with gifts, gathering intelligence, positioning forces, and then demanding surrender backed by threats of annihilation. The Admiral's voice carried the weight of decades spent fighting off one attempted conquest after another, and the alien's eyes widened as he realized that his species was not the first to try this strategy on humanity. In space around Luna Station, human ships began to decloak from hiding positions that the Zilani scouts had never detected, and the alien fleet found itself facing over 200 warships that had been concealed using technology the invaders had not even known existed. The Zilani had counted on their intelligence gathering to give them accurate information about human defensive capabilities, but they had been fed false data that made their enemy appear weak and unprepared when the opposite was actually true. Commander Sandra Kelly's voice echoed through the command center as she reported that all Zilani personnel on the station were now in custody, and her security teams had found military-grade scanning equipment hidden in diplomatic pouches along with evidence of attempted sabotage in critical engineering sections. The aliens had been preparing to disable the station's defenses from the inside while their fleet attacked from outside, but human paranoia and careful surveillance had turned their own people into evidence of their hostile intentions. The Zilani ambassador's diplomatic mask finally fell away completely as he realized that his mission had failed, and he warned that humanity could not resist the Zilani forever because their fleet numbered in the thousands and they had conquered entire sectors of the galaxy. Jake leaned back in his chair and told the alien that he had made a critical error by assuming that younger species were automatically less intelligent than older ones, because humans had a unique gift for learning from their mistakes and the mistakes of others. Admiral Wong continued the explanation by pointing out that after the third species had tried to pull the same conquest trick on humanity, human leaders had started developing countermeasures, and by the seventh species, they had gotten really good at turning predators into prey. The tactical display showed the Zilani fleet completely surrounded by human ships that had emerged from behind every asteroid, moon, and space station in the system, because the aliens' superior numbers meant nothing when they were trapped in a carefully prepared kill zone. Chief Engineer Danny Collins reported from his station that the alien ships were trying to charge their weapons, and he asked for permission to fire first, but Jake told him to wait because humanity wanted the galaxy to see clearly who the real aggressors were in this situation. The captain knew that the political implications of this confrontation would echo across known space, and he wanted every neutral observer to understand that humans had been defending themselves against unprovoked attack. The Zilani fleet commander spoke through the ambassador's communication link and called humans primitive mammals who dared to threaten the mighty Zilani hegemony, and his words revealed the arrogance and contempt that had driven his species to believe they could easily conquer another civilization. Jake smiled grimly and told Admiral Wong that the alien's mask had finally come off completely, showing the galaxy exactly what kind of beings they were dealing with, and why humanity had learned to be suspicious of peaceful overtures. Dr. Hayes, who had been watching the confrontation in stunned silence, finally spoke up about all the cultural exchanges and conversations about art and philosophy that had seemed so genuine during the past week. Lieutenant Blake explained that those interactions had been standard psychological profiling designed to find weaknesses in human society and ways to exploit emotional and cultural vulnerabilities, which was remarkably effective against species that had not encountered such tactics before. Jake stood up and addressed the Zilani ambassador directly, giving him exactly 10 minutes to order his fleet to withdraw from human space or face the consequences of starting a war they could not win. The captain warned that if even one alien ship charged weapons or attempted to break containment, humanity would demonstrate why 13 previous species had learned to leave Earth alone, and his voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who held all the best cards in a deadly game. The alien's expression shifted from anger to uncertainty as he realized that his species had walked into a trap of their own making, and he asked if humanity would really risk war with the entire hegemony over what he still tried to call a misunderstanding. Admiral Wong stepped forward and told him there was no misunderstanding involved, because the aliens had come to conquer and humanity was simply declining their offer, and the only question now was whether they would leave quietly or become another cautionary tale passed around diplomatic circles. As tension in the command center reached its peak, sensor arrays across the system detected something that made even the most experienced veterans smile with satisfaction, because the Zilani fleet was powering down their weapons and beginning to withdraw from human space like predators who had suddenly realized they were facing bigger predators. Humanity had read the alien playbook, prepared the perfect countermoves, and won another round in the ongoing game of galactic survival that had been going on for 50 years. 6 months after the Zilani incident, Captain Jake Morrison found himself in a completely different kind of meeting as representatives from 5 alien species sat around the conference table aboard his ship, but this time they were not offering gifts or peace treaties. Instead, they were asking for advice on how to survive in a galaxy full of predators. The irony was not lost on Jake as he looked at beings whose civilizations were centuries older than humanity. Yet they had come to learn from the species they had once dismissed as primitive newcomers to the galactic community. The Altarian delegate spoke first, her crystalline features reflecting worry as she explained that intelligence reports indicated hegemony forces were moving toward their territory, and her people wanted help preparing defenses against an enemy they had never faced before. Jake exchanged glances with Admiral Wong, who had become something of a celebrity in diplomatic circles as the architect of humanity's defensive strategies, because both humans understood how strange it was to have ancient civilizations seeking military advice from a species that had achieved spaceflight less than a century ago. Jake told the aliens that humanity could certainly share their experiences, but first he needed to understand their current defensive capabilities and early warning systems, because every species had different strengths and weaknesses that needed to be considered when planning a defense. The Kepler Confederation representative, a being that looked like an upright insect, clicked nervously as he explained that his people had enjoyed peaceful relations with their neighbors for over 3 centuries and had never faced systematic deception of the kind humans described. Commander Pete Rodriguez, who now served as Jake's chief tactical advisor, activated a holographic display and explained that peaceful civilizations were exactly what made species vulnerable to hegemony tactics, because conquest-oriented aliens specifically targeted neighbors who were unprepared for coordinated deception and psychological warfare. The commander had spent months analyzing the patterns used by 14 different predatory species, and he had developed training programs that could help peaceful civilizations recognize the warning signs before it was too late. Dr. Lisa Hayes had become an expert in identifying pre-conquest behavioral patterns after her experience with the Zilani, and she addressed the group with the knowledge of someone who had learned to spot deception disguised as friendship. The doctor explained that the key was recognizing early warning signs like unsolicited contact, offers that seem too generous, requests for detailed infrastructure information, and attempts to position themselves as intermediaries between target species and their existing allies. Lieutenant Ryan Blake had prepared detailed intelligence briefings for each species represented at the meeting because his team had documented the standard operating procedures of every conquest-oriented civilization they had encountered, and the patterns were remarkably consistent once observers knew what to look for. Blake explained that predatory species relied on their victims not sharing information with each other, which allowed the same tactics to work repeatedly against isolated civilizations. The vegan representative spoke quietly about how his people had been devastated by a similar attack only 2 years earlier, and he asked how humanity had developed such effective countermeasures so quickly, when their species was so much younger than the civilizations they were now protecting. Jake considered his answer carefully because he wanted to give these beings hope while also helping them understand the hard lessons that humanity had learned through bitter experience. Jake explained that humans had several advantages that most species did not possess, starting with natural suspicion that came from their own history of conflict and competition, which had prepared them to expect deception even from seemingly friendly contacts. He continued by pointing out that humanity had been attacked early in their development, so they learned to defend themselves before they became complacent, and most importantly, they shared information freely among their own kind instead of keeping secrets that could help their enemies. Admiral Wong added that the most important factor in human survival had been treating each encounter as a learning experience, studying not just what worked but also what failed, and analyzing the mistakes of other species to incorporate those lessons into their own strategies. The Admiral explained that most civilizations never survived their first encounter with predatory aliens, which meant that only paranoid species lived long enough to become experienced in galactic defense. The Altarian delegate leaned forward and asked if humanity would be willing to establish formal defensive pacts with other species, and Jake and Wong had anticipated this question because the debate within human leadership had been intense about whether to remain isolated or build alliances. Some human leaders argued for staying out of other species' problems, while others saw an opportunity to create a true defensive network that could protect everyone. Admiral Wong announced that humanity was prepared to offer something better than traditional military alliances, describing a mutual defense network based on shared intelligence and coordinated response protocols where each species contributed their unique strengths instead of following human leadership. The proposal called for the Altarians to provide advanced shield technology, the Kepler Confederation to offer sophisticated sensor networks, and other species to add their own capabilities to a growing alliance of survivors. Over the following weeks, what became known as the Terran Protocol was implemented across 17 star systems as each member species contributed their best defensive technologies and strategies to a shared database that no single predatory civilization could overcome. The humans provided expertise in psychological warfare and deception tactics, while their allies offered technological advantages that made the entire network stronger than any individual member could be alone. 6 months later, when hegemony forces attempted their next conquest, they found not isolated and unprepared prey, but a coordinated network of species that had learned to recognize and counter standard predatory tactics before the attacks could succeed. The would-be conquerors found themselves facing the same treatment the Zilani had received, trapped and outmaneuvered by defenders, who had turned the tables on species that had dominated the galaxy for centuries. In his final log entry about the Zilani incident, Jake wrote that the galaxy was full of predators who relied on deception and superior technology to overcome their prey, but they all made the same mistake of assuming that younger or less advanced species were automatically less capable of learning and adapting. He noted that humanity's greatest weapon was not their technology or tactics, but their ability to turn experience into wisdom and wisdom into survival, which had allowed them to break the cycle of conquest that had claimed so many other civilizations. The Terran Protocol grew to include 43 star systems within 2 years, and the hegemony species found their expansion halted for the first time in centuries, not by superior firepower but by civilizations that had learned to recognize deception and turn predatory tactics against their users. Peace was no longer effective bait for conquest because the galaxy had finally read the standard playbook and humanity had written detailed instructions on how to survive every chapter.